This is Transformation Ground Control, your source for all things business, technology, strategy, and change. If you're growing your business, leading change within your organization, or undertaking any sort of operational or technology change initiative, this podcast is for you. This show covers what you need to know about digital transformation, organizational change, operational improvement, and business growth.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
And now, here's your host, Eric Kimberling.
Hello and welcome to Transformation Ground Control. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm here with Paresa and Kyler from Third Stage. Paresa and Kyler, welcome.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you.
Thanks for being here today. We're excited for a show today and another epic episode of Transformation Ground Control. We have a couple great guests here today. Later in the show, we're going to have Nate Stroeher from Third Stage. He's a director on our team. He's going to be talking about, or actually, we're going to play you a clip from a recent Full Throttle event that we hosted where Nate talked about change management. And so he's going to be talking about change management methodologies and best practices. And so we're going to actually play that clip later in the podcast. And before we get to Nate, we're going to have another guest, Mike Bestvina from Renna Partners is going to be on. And he's going to talk about how to manage IT organizations within high growth and private equity owned organizations. So we're going to talk about some of the IT aspects and the IT transformation aspects of those sorts of situations. But before we get to Mike and Nate later in the show, just to start off, one of the things we're going to talk about with Mike when he comes on after a break, we're going to talk about M&A and high growth types of companies that are going through transformation. Well, let's just talk about M&A and growth just in general. So maybe I'll turn over to you, Paresa. I know you had some thoughts or threads you wanted to cover here today.
Yeah, well, it's interesting the time that we're in because there are so many different trends that are taking wind and growing. And one of those is the rate of mergers and acquisitions just across the world. We are at an absolute record for how the value of mergers and acquisitions, and it's actually up 158% during the same period from last year. So if you look across all of 2021, across the whole world, we are at $2.4 trillion in the value of mergers and acquisitions. So huge growth. And if you think about it, there's so many shifting industries, consumer behavior is shifting. There's new initiatives going on, pushing different industries in different directions. So it makes sense from that angle, but there's also the thought that there's a lot of confidence because the stock market is doing well. And one thing that stood out is interest rates are so low. So borrowing money right now is fairly cheap when you look at it relatively, right? So I think all of these different elements are making up the prime time, if you will, for mergers and acquisitions across almost every industry. But what's interesting is usually it's the tech space that's seeing a lot of mergers and acquisitions. But the month of May kind of turned the tech industry to take a back seat to media and entertainment. And media and entertainment deals accounted for over a quarter, I think it was 29% of merger and acquisition value in the month of May. So looking at, the huge deals such as Warner Media, I think buying Discovery, that was a $43 billion merger. You have Amazon, that's just kind of slowly taking over the world, buying MGM and adding that to their portfolio. So now they have Whole Foods and MGM. Funny how that works. But it's just everywhere. Every industry, you see a lot of companies kind of coming together. And beyond that, a few other noteworthy mergers that I noted were, I think it's pronounced Danaher, bought a huge supplier for Moderna, so a biotech company called Aldevron. I think that's how you say it, Aldevron. And it was a $9.6 billion cash deal. So they came to the table and said, hello, here is $9.6 billion, and kind of took over operations there. And then last week on our episode, we were talking about electric vehicles, and Ford just bought an EV charging management platform called Electrify. And, I don't know if you guys have had a Ford vehicle in the recent, years. I don't know when they implemented this, but, we drive a Ford and it comes with an app right now where it's connected to your car. You can turn your car on using the app. It tells you, how's your oil level? Do you have gas? You can pretty much manage your whole car from your app. And I'm guessing that this software is going to be integrated into their existing app so that if you do have an electric vehicle, you can see, what's my charge level at? Do I need to charge my car? It's so different having that come out of my mouth because usually you're charging your phone, so it's weird. But it makes sense. And Ford is gearing toward making almost half of their like plethora of automobiles electric by 2030. So less than 10 years, they're planning to be at 40% electric vehicles. So, with all of these, industries moving and shaking, it makes sense that mergers and acquisitions are popular right now and I think more popular than ever before. But, looking at even the Ford example, having the software element on two different companies coming together as one, I imagine is probably one of the most challenging elements of a merger and acquisition. I mean, there's so many different facets from, two different cultures, two different processes, or probably way more than two different processes, but everything coming together to become one. I feel like there's a lot of room for error if you don't do it right. And we talk a lot about ERP failures, but is there such thing as a merger and acquisition failure? I mean, have you heard of that or seen that before?
Yeah, and you're right on all fronts there. I mean, the merger and acquisition failures are very common. I studied when I was getting my master's, I studied mergers and acquisitions, or that was one of the things I studied. And I remember there's a statistic that was north of 80% of merger and acquisition integrations fail. And most of the time, or the most common reasons they fail is because the cultures don't integrate. So you've got not only the operational disparity that you're talking about, but you also alluded to culture, and that cultural piece is the number one reason why M&A integrations don't work. And it's a lot like digital transformation in a lot of ways, to your point, because you're trying to totally change something in a short period of time, and that's just difficult to do. It's like doing open heart surgery on a marathon runner while they're running a race or something. It's just a difficult proposition. So yeah, there is absolutely an issue with that, and I think a lot of M&As fail to realize the value because of that.
Wow. That's actually the last thing I would have thought it would be due to is culture. I feel like it would be more so the processes or figuring out how to, integrate the softwares, but it really just comes down to the people. That's crazy.
You're telling me after 41 episodes of doing ground control with me, you still don't know that I'm always going to come back to change management. It doesn't matter what you're talking about. I'm probably going to come back to change management.
Touche. You're right. It's a big part of it. I mean, okay, in that case, then let me ask you this question. So what should leaders be aware of when it comes to change management, when it comes to, obviously OCM as it pertains to mergers and acquisitions?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's two things. One is on maybe the more strategic due diligence front, organizations need to be looking at assessing what the cultures of the organizations are. I think a lot of private equity types tend to look at the stuff they can see on paper. They look at the P&Ls, they look at, the cash flow and what the financial synergies might be, and they look at the strategic synergies and all the stuff on paper that may look like a dream matchup. It very well I cannot talk today. It very well may be a dream matchup, but in the sense of the other stuff. But when you get to culture, you have two different cultures, like if one organization is super, let's say, command and control, top down, sort of environment, and then you've got another company that's totally entrepreneurial and decentralized, shoot from the hip. It may be that, let's just say, the top down company wants to go acquire that entrepreneurial company because it drives growth and they want to become more entrepreneurial. A lot of companies try to buy their way into that mindset or into that culture without realizing that you're just going to frustrate both cultures, and it's going to create so much tension and chaos within the organization. So I think probably the biggest thing, PE types or people that are doing due diligence, part of a merger or acquisition should also be looking at culture and how cultures are different, and understanding how much different are they? Are they this far apart, which may be too much to overcome, or is it more sort of an incremental shift that might be more manageable? And I haven't seen a lot of PE types really look into that when they do their due diligence. So that'd be a way to start. And then the second thing I'd say is on the integration. When you actually get to the integration, a lot of times the focus is again on technology. It's on the processes and how you bring together the processes, how you bring together the product lines and all the tangible stuff. But then they overlook the organizational change piece of it. How do we redesign the organization? How do we move people along and bring them all together as one team? That people piece of it, just like in digital transformations, tends to get overlooked quite a bit. So those are the two things I'd say on the strategic due diligence front. There's a piece of it, and then certainly on the execution, once the decision's been made, that's important too.
That's interesting. So then, would you say there's a company that has exactly what you want that would fill the puzzle piece of your future state, but their culture is totally opposite to yours. Should you run the other direction, or should you find a way to make it work?
I don't know. That's tough. I mean, it's rare to see that succeed, when they're so different, when they're polar opposite types of culture. That's why I say, if you're sort of let's just say you're an organization that's on a scale, you're leaning a little bit towards being command and control versus complete extreme command and control. And you want to go buy an organization that's a little more flexible or a little more entrepreneurial than you, that might be a better fit and more manageable because you're shifting the needle rather than just totally ripping out one of the two cultures and trying to replace one with the other, or sometimes worse yet, trying to integrate two cultures that are like oil and water. Is that the cliche? Or is it oil and gas? I always get confused. Oil and water, I think.
Oil and water.
Yeah, that makes more sense.
That's a good analogy. Yeah. Wow, that's interesting. Well, I know that you and Mike are going to get into it a little bit more too on just the ins and outs of scaling a company. And I know a lot of what you guys are talking about is mergers and acquisition. I mean, acquiring a company is a key way to scale your business. So, the different elements that come with that to drive the success behind the IT specifically, that's what you guys are going to talk about. And I'm curious to see Mike's perspective on it too.
Yeah, and I'll be curious to hear, some of the drivers for that M&A, those record-setting M&A levels that you were describing before. I think that's super fascinating. And the other part that's interesting about that too, that I want to dive into with Mike a little bit, is when you have the economy. Anytime the economy is in turmoil or going through some sort of change, that's usually when there's a lot of M&A activity, because you've got weaker players out there, and the stronger ones are trying to buy up the weaker ones, or the stronger ones see an opportunity to scale even more when things are going through change. So I'd be curious to see, what he's seeing, just because he specializes in M&A and high growth types of situations. So look forward to that as well. So we'll take a quick break, and we're going to bring Mike onto the show. And we're going to dive into this a little bit more, not just from an M&A perspective, by the way. We're also just going to talk about growth in general. So even if you're part of an organization that maybe it's not an M&A situation, but you're going through growth, that's the sort of theme we wanted to cover within that discussion. So we're going to have Mike on the show right after a quick break. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
Hey, feeling good, like I should. When in dark, walk around the neighborhood.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstageconsulting.com.
Hey, feeling good, like I should. When in dark, walk around the neighborhood. Feeling blessed.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm here with Paresa and Kyler from the Third Stage team. You can find us live on YouTube. We go live on YouTube every Wednesday morning in the U.S. or U.S. time, I should say. You can watch us wherever you're based, anywhere in the world, but U.S. time, Wednesday mornings. You can find us on YouTube. You can also find us on all the podcast platforms, Spotify, Pandora, Apple Music, Google, whatever platform of choice you prefer. You can find us there. So we're going to bring on our next guest, Mike Bestvina from Renna Partners. And Renna is an organization. We're going to dive into a more formal introduction here in a second, but Renna is an organization that helps clients with their merger and acquisition integration and among other things. And so we're going to talk about high growth situations and how to scale IT and IT functions for high growth situations. So that being said, Mike, welcome to the show.
Thanks, sir. Appreciate it.
Yeah. So before we get started here and sort of fire away with some starting point questions that I have, and then certainly we'll open it up to audience questions as well as we're going here. And by the way, for those of you listening live, please feel free to chat at any time. Just pop in a question and we'll get to those. But maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself and then a little bit about Renna, if you don't mind.
Sure. So nice to meet you, everybody. It's Mike Bestvina. I started my career actually at SAP. I've actually worked in the ERP space for quite a bit, and actually maintain a lot of my background has been on sort of software providers in enterprise software. So actually sitting on the sort of software provider side, but kind of balance between that with actual implementation of going into companies and putting ERP systems in. So for about the last 6 years, I've been working almost exclusively in M&A with sort of technology lens around that. Renna Partners was started about 3 years ago. A former business partner of mine, him and I started this off, and actually with another partner of ours. And we've grown quite a bit in the last couple of years. As you mentioned, our focus has been technology strategy. So we're a boutique firm that works almost exclusively, I would say, in middle market private equity. So call it middle market and lower middle market. So to your point around sort of IT strategy, a lot of what we see is acquisitions being done in that space. And that can go from everything from kind of your classic manufacturing, distribution, healthcare, business services companies, retail, through to technology-enabled businesses. So business services, for example, that might have built their own proprietary technology, all the way through to what is kind of, I would say, called technology-led or software companies, as they're probably more widely known. And so what we do is we do a lot of due diligence in terms of helping clients support those transactions on the buy side, do a little bit of sell side, and then a lot of sort of, as you can imagine in today's environment, there's a lot of carve-outs and sort of interesting mergers happening. So we help our clients kind of navigate how technology should be used, how much they should be spending on technology throughout those sort of complexities. And to your point, when we think about growth, in our space, growth has a lot to do with acquisitions and also complexities around that. And so what we're helping sort of clients do and understand is how do you navigate those things? How do you navigate them in a meaningful way? And they can be very complex and difficult. And I think I've got my fair share of war stories, as I'm sure you have, about what can go wrong if you don't do it the right way.
Yeah. And it's a totally different mindset too, when you think about growth and scaling. And certainly if you're a large organization going out to acquire other companies, I mean, it's just a different level of maturity and capability you need to get there. And certainly want to get to that here in a second. So great. It's good to have you on the show, and I'm excited to dive into some of these topics with you in a little bit more detail. As we're getting started here, one last request for the audience that's listening live. If you don't mind, just pop in the chat box where you're joining us from. What part of the world are you in? What city are you in? Typically we have a pretty global audience, so it's always interesting to see what regions of the world that everyone is joining us here today. And I'll circle back to that here in a second and let Mike know where all these people are joining from that we've got here on the line here. So I guess just to start, Mike, while we're waiting to hear where people are joining from, what are some of if we sort of just set the context here of growth and scale and how IT and the technology function within an organization can support that scale, or in some cases, as you mentioned, it might undermine that ability to scale. What are some of the biggest challenges that you see that IT departments have when they're scaling for growth, whether it's M&A related growth or even organic growth? I imagine there's some differences, but there's also probably quite a few similarities as well.
Sure. So, in a lot of cases, the first person that's asking us about those questions are typically sort of our financial sponsors, who are usually private equity firms. And I think it's important, just context one from our experience, but then how that sort of translate down into the companies themselves and the portfolio companies or a company that's potentially being acquired. There's sort of the big question is, can the system scale, right? And I think what we often have to do is sort of parse what that actually means. I think when the technologist in me says, can the thing scale, I think we'll just throw more hardware at it, right? And I think the reality is actually it's obviously a lot more nuanced than that. And I think that's really the important part, I think, to get right before even talking about like what are the challenges. And so, because the challenges become very obvious when you start to think about what does scale actually mean. One big thing I think that we often find are like historic legacy systems, and I would say more categorically known as, call it, technical debt, is always a serious concern to scale. That's a pretty obvious one, just because it's when you see it, that it can present a situation. And I think to get more sort of technical on those things is what we'll often find is that there's paradigms that may have been used 30 years ago that no longer are needed or no longer have advantages to them. And so because the environment has changed, then therefore the scaling becomes a challenge. I think one of the biggest areas there, and has been talked about for 60 years probably, is integration. The ability to integrate into other systems or have other systems integrate back into your systems becomes incredibly important, because what ends up happening is you want to have that flexibility and agility. And if you talk to any of these companies, you talk to the business people and then you talk to the IT people, there's always incongruence between the two, because the IT people want to have control and they want to have sort of steady rates of how things get adopted. And the business just wants to get the business done in the most efficient way possible without, discerning between business processes and whatnot. So integration becomes a huge point of contention, but also a huge point of how do you scale a system. Another thing that we see often, especially in acquisitions, is we're starting to see more and more companies acquire more tangential businesses, meaning not just consolidation of industries, but actual going into other markets. So a very classic example is you have sort of the wholesaler, distributor, retailer function that's in some cases being completely vertically integrated now. And in that case, you now look at IT and you might have a distribution system that's set up in a way for a distributor. And now they want to sell online, for example, and become much more like a retailer and get more margin. All of a sudden now they can't get their inventory, values out. And in fact, we've seen this. It's in some ways, I would say, crazy, but I'm sure there's some audience members that can relate to this, is, having to manually take e-commerce orders and then punch them into an ERP system. Yeah. And so all of a sudden now the system that didn't even know what e-commerce was because they implemented it 20 years. And even if they upgraded the system, it may even have that sort of integration point, but it doesn't have that built in. All of a sudden now has to adapt to the changing environment. So I think those are some really common things that we see, that it's not even just a, hey, can the system technically take more load? It's actually the environment changed, and now we need to adapt to that environment, and our system can't adapt to that environment.
Yeah. Yeah. You probably remember the days too. I think we started our careers around the same time, but you probably remember the days where scalability meant, can we handle the transaction volume? And you would actually evaluate that, as part of our ERP evaluations way back when. You'd say, hey, can this system handle, 10,000 sales orders a month or whatever the number is? And now that's not really as much of an issue as what you're talking about, which is more of the general capabilities and, are those capabilities keeping up with the changing aspect of your business?
Right.
And along those lines, are you seeing with some of this M&A work you're doing and some of these, you guys are seeing I'd say pretty dramatic or extreme growth situations, because there's an injection of capital of some sort or an acquisition, or in some cases a carve out, or, there's just a lot of change or turmoil, for better or for worse, in those situations. But are you seeing that that's been accelerated with just the current environment that we're in? I know you and I were talking before we went live here a little bit about how, the market's going crazy on the M&A side, and there's just a lot of acquisitions happening. But tell us maybe a little bit about what you're seeing there in the market in general.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are two factors. One, desire to grow, which is always a factor. But I think that there's being pressure because you have, if you look at public markets, right? Because everything kind of derives from public markets, right? And so where is all the growth happening? And I'm saying this from a sort of non-COVID perspective, right? Well, this trend was happening anyway, even before COVID, where software companies were becoming kind of much more commonplace because they were actually producing financials, and then going public, and people were realizing that these companies are actually really printing cash. And so now you had this whole sector of people that were chasing those deals, and now they're saying to the sort of more traditional, let's call it the GEs and the Walmarts of the world, saying, hey, you guys got to go compete with these guys, because if I'm going to put my dollar into a company today, an investment, I want it to double instead of just going at 8 to 10% a year. And even if that is the case, everything is being more attracted towards those investments. So what's happening, I think, is there's pressure to grow, and to find ways to grow, and all that growth is in technology. And then two, which is another huge factor, regardless of even if that was the first part was true, is we're just the market's flush with capital right now. So companies have capital to spend, and the investors are telling them they need to spend it, which is wise. And so one way to do that is to go acquire businesses. And so we're just in an incredibly, I don't even know if lucrative is the right word to use. But there's a lot of activity done in this space, and which is driving that, and people are trying to diversify products and services. And so ultimately what that leads to is acquisitions of companies. And then now what is becoming much more salient for a salient point for us is how do you then deal with that from a technology perspective? So even if it isn't sort of investing in new technology and services, and it's just purely about buying other companies, well, there's a huge technology component that comes into integration between companies, and ultimately that comes down to operations. And ultimate operations, seems pretty obvious, but once the businesses are under one sort of roof, there's some serious synergies to be had by having everything controlled from one space. Not everybody does it that way, based on how they want to do it, but as a general rule of thumb is you can see some advantages there. So what we see a lot is, okay, we bought this company in order to grow, and so growth no longer means growing by just selling more widgets. It's about acquiring the business, but now we have to go do this whole effort in order to get systems consolidated so that I can take advantage of partly why I would even buy this business for the crazy multiples that I'm paying today.
Yeah. It's an interesting time, I think, in general, not just for M&A, but if you just look back up and look at the corporate world in general and the level of disruption that's happening. And when I say disruption, that's not necessarily good or bad. It's just change, basically. But you look at what you're talking about, which is all this M&A activity happening, and that forces a certain amount of change on organizations. And then even for organizations that aren't going through M&A, you've got supply chain bottlenecks and disruptions. You have changing consumer demand. You mentioned retail and how now all of a sudden companies are sort of being forced into an e-commerce model that they weren't prepared for and their systems weren't built for, and they're kind of forcing that change is being forced upon them. So it's a really interesting time in the industry. I don't recall anything quite as turmoil based or disruptive as the time we're in right now, in my career, at least. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I mean, well, the funny one too is a lot of these trends were already happening, and then they all got accelerated last year. I think I forget if I don't know if I feel like you guys sent this or somebody sent this to me or I saw it. there was a little infographic, and it had 2 bars, and it said, what change is driving my digital transformation? And it was like 15% came from the CIO, and then 85% came from COVID.
Right.
And so it was,
that too.
and what was it? It's obviously it's sort of just a light touch joke about how what impact that's had, but I think it actually what really it speaks to is the reality of business, which is for the longest time, and I'm sure you probably have hundreds, if not thousands, of pieces of content that talk about this. But the word digital transformation has been used for the last 15 years, and all of a sudden, in the last 18 months, it was like if you're a CIO and you didn't do anything, you'd lose your job. Whereas actually, you'd lose your job if you tried to go do a digital transformation project and it didn't work. And so that was the risk, and now the risk has turned over to I simply can't not do something type of thing. So and I think that to me is what has that's driving a lot of reaction, which was the trends were already there. It's not as if companies said, well, this whole remote working thing's not going to work. It was just, we don't know if we can succeed right now. And obviously the environment has now pushed that. And that's, it's interesting. It's one of the things we talk about in software development is a lot of companies say they'll build something in software and say, well, it's done, right? There's nothing more I need to do. And it's like, well, sure. Even if you feel like you're feature complete, software is a never ending story because the environment will eventually change at some point. The word entropy talks about the environment changing, and therefore whatever the substance that you're talking about starts to degrade because the environment degrades, not the actual substance itself. And that's so true in the IT environment, is that this environment is going to change. Today it's mobile phones. Well, maybe in 20 years, I'm somewhat bearish on VR, but let's say it's VR. We need to, your system needs to be able to adapt to that changing environment.
Right.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
This next question I have for you, you alluded a little bit to earlier when you were talking about a sort of myopic view of IT and looking at hardware. I think that's one of the first things you mentioned is like the technologist in you said would typically kind of start off by looking at the hardware, but then obviously there's a lot more to it than just hardware when you think about how to scale an organization. But when you think about the ways that, or the things that are required to scale an organization for growth and the ways that IT needs to support that growth, what are some of the things that executives and CIOs are most likely to overlook, or that you most commonly see them not really thinking about when it comes to scaling?
The basics. Honestly, I mean, it is shocking. I'm still surprised today just to see how many of the basics just get overlooked. And like, I'm talking about basic things like backups and recovery and to be fair, I think the reason that it's a challenge is because what is going back to the point before is that the environment has changed, right? So even if you traditionally had an ERP system that might have been installed, on premise, and that's fine, and you're backing that system up, well, I don't know, there may have something changed, like that is now hosted in a data center. You might have moved to a colo or even in a cloud provider, and you just, as part of that process, never really thought about backups. And I know that sounds sort of basic to some of our audience, but at the same time, I'm always shocked to see how much that's overlooked. And then what that looks like then from and so this is where the challenge to scale becomes sort of a factor, is because oftentimes then we look almost myopically to say, hey, I want to be able to scale this system technically because I got to go add 500 users. And so then I just move to a cloud provider. And now all of a sudden the cloud provider, they've got a backup strategy that comes in that. And so and now it's a new territory. And I think that's often what happens, is trying to translate what we've learned in the 90s and the 80s and from like mainframes, 3-tier architectures. We put all these processes, these procedures in place, and all of a sudden it's like, I shouldn't say it this way, but it's the reaction that when I see it is like, it's like you guys forgot about the basics. But I understand why it's happened. It's because the need to be able to scale those systems, because they put it into a different paradigm. And so therefore trying to translate what you've traditionally done into those new environments is not easy. I mean, if you look at AWS's product catalog, I think it's I forget what the number is now. It's got to be something like 120 services. So if I was a CIO and somebody was saying, hey, which service to use, I mean, I'd have the biggest blank stare ever, right? And that was, if you looked at AWS maybe 8 years ago, it's probably like 10. So I can certainly appreciate that when you do want to take on some of these new paradigms, that the basics then start to change. So, a CIO in today's world might be having consultants come in and say, well, you should containerize everything and it'll solve everything. And it's like, what the heck is a container? And so and now does a container need a backup, and like all these types of things, right? So I can certainly empathize with a lot of people in these positions, because yes, there is advantages to moving to some of these things, but oftentimes it has to be done in a way that understands what scale is required for that specific situation, right? Mm-hmm. So we talked about this before already, which is, does scale mean I need more users on it? Does scale mean I'm going to change my business? Does scale mean I'm going to invest into things that will help me change my business in the future? And I think that's where, I mean, we do, at the end of the day, we're working on IT strategy, and that's why IT strategy is so important. And it's so important to get right. And it starts with the business strategy. And so if the business strategy is done right, the IT strategy can be done right. And if it is done right, then the systems get done correctly.
Yeah. Yeah. And making sure that the IT strategy is indeed supporting and aligned with that business strategy. Do you ever find that to be a challenge, where at the corporate executive level, you've got sort of one vision and view of the world, and whether it's an M&A event or just growth in general, but then your IT strategy sort of supporting that is just out of sync, or they don't recognize the connection there?
The most common problem I see there is that the IT doesn't even, aren't brought to the table for the business strategy discussion, number one, or number two, they don't seek it out. And that's often, frankly, why we're asked to come in sometimes, is because there is that mismatch. And so we're able to come in and say, here's what you guys need to do from an IT strategy perspective. Oh, by the way, in order for us to help you do that, we don't even want to talk technology until we talk business first.
Gotcha. Okay. Yeah, that's interesting for sure. And just making sure you've got that all in sync is key. And that we see that a lot too with our clients, is just making sure either you have IT at the table when you're talking about strategy, or at the very least, a second best but less desirable option is that just make sure that IT strategy gets aligned with the business strategy and the overall executive strategy. What about the people side of things? So when you think about just human behavior, organizational change, how does that factor into building stronger IT capabilities to help scale and fuel growth?
Yeah, I think so. There's two common things that I see. So from an executive standpoint, there are two types of, I would call it, personas that we see at the IT management level. There are people who are very good at vision and strategy, and there's people that are very good at execution. And so from the management layer, from an org perspective, being able to do both of those is incredibly sort of attractive from the rest of the sort of financial sponsor, board level type of people. So being able to do both of those is incredibly important. And that goes back to exactly the point I just made, which is those types of people are able to understand and be part of a business strategy discussion and then translate that. And then once they've done that, actually go execute it. So, we've certainly seen companies where a CIO or CTO has very lofty goals, and then when they go to do pen to paper, it's sort of not there. So, and I think, from a skill set standpoint, that's probably one of the biggest themes that we see. Day-to-day type of operations, we're starting to see, I think, a lot more, and I would say situations where IT is much more sort of back office related. I think a lot of the day-to-day IT activities are being outsourced to managed service providers, which to be honest is, I think, actually a pretty good strategy, just as a general, it has to fit the organization. The challenge that we then see is, because the point in doing all of that is standardizing processes. And so what that means then for changing organizations is, how do you move some of the sort of day-to-day activities over to a managed service provider, and then have the IT organization focus on things that are much more strategic, which I think as a general principle is sort of a good strategy. Obviously, some nuance depending on the situation. And so what ends up becoming actually more interesting then for a lot of management teams who are still doing day-to-day activities for the business is then understanding how to do partner management. And so oftentimes what we see is using a managed service provider just as a panacea to go solve IT issues. What ends up happening is that MSP might go and say, oh yeah, we do your security for you, or we ensure that everybody's on updated systems. And then you go and you see an audit and it's like, well, 10% of the organization is still on Windows XP. And you guys know that there's a security issue with that. Well, the MSP has no incentive to go and update that. So I think that's where some of the challenge that we've seen a lot is not even just like, hey, we need to go outsource this because it's cheaper, but just outsource this because it's less strategic. And then having the IT organization be focusing on those much more strategic initiatives. The problem is, and it goes back to what I said before, is that then they lose the basics, right? It's like, yeah, well, we had this MSP go and check this for us, and they're making sure that all of our systems are on the latest version of Windows. Well, sure. Well, what ended up happening was they just gave you the report that said that 10% of your organization is on XP, but nobody's actually executing on that. And so that's where partner management becomes a lot more important for those organizations. And so the skill sets are becoming around partner management, and then you're getting a big explosive growth in the whole MSP sort of space, which is, look, I just need to be able to do help desk type stuff. I don't want to manage it internally. I want to be more strategic about technology.
So is that desire to outsource certain parts of IT, is that pretty common or pretty widespread with the clients you work with?
Yeah, I mean, well, I don't. So outsource. First of all, I feel like outsource gets a bad rap, right?
Yeah.
And so I think 25 years ago, let's say, it was like everything was outsourcing, right? Let's go build the largest team possible in China or India or wherever as quickly as possible, and do it for as cheap as possible, because IT is not a strategic function. And if we remember those conversations, right? It's really interesting to think about them now, because it's almost done a complete flip, which is, it's like, well, technology now has to be strategic. And I think this is, to me, is probably the biggest challenges for most organizations, is being able to discern between what parts of IT functions are strategic and which is sort of day-to-day business as usual, keep the lights on type of thing. And so to me, that's where it becomes incredibly important.
Yeah. And certainly if you're using cloud technologies or other types of things that lend themselves, that sort of by definition is going to be more of a, call it an outsourced model, even though that may not be the intent. You're inherently shifting some of that maintenance and break fix type stuff over to an outside vendor or an MSP in that way. So
yeah, well, and it's exactly the point we talked about before. Like, I mean, there's almost a PhD required just to understand what every AWS service does, right? And so it's like asking somebody to go and say, hey, we're going to go migrate my whole data center over to Amazon Web Services. And just to do a lift and shift, actually economically, that usually doesn't make any sense to go do that. But we see a lot of companies do it. It then becomes, well, how do I take advantage of this new web service that AWS just came out with? And just being able to navigate that alone requires almost like a full-time resource. So I think that's where it starts to change a little bit, and the expertise is changing. But this is no different, 20, 30 years ago when somebody said, I need to go stand up a data center somewhere. And you're like, I don't know what a data center is, but I know that I don't want to have this server in my office anymore.
Yeah. It's interesting the way you frame a lot of this in the context of how a lot of this isn't new. It's just a lot of this is being accelerated. I think is one of the comments you made that, a lot of the stuff was brewing or percolating under the surface or was starting to pick up momentum, and then COVID hits and, suddenly a bunch of M&A activity happens. A lot of stuff is sort of speeding this up or adding fuel to the fire in a lot of ways.
Yep.
Now, what about cybersecurity? How are you seeing cybersecurity fit into to scaling IT organizations? And especially recently, it seems like that's another area that's really picking up steam and picking up a sense of urgency, is making sure you lock down your systems when you have, US pipelines being hacked and supply chain related organizations being hacked, and a lot of that stuff happening throughout the world. How is that factoring into scaling an IT organization?
If anything, it's slowing it. And so what's interesting is there's actually a really good sort of conversation about this, which is security is at the antithesis of accessibility. And so what that means in practice is that when you look at organizations who are trying to go and digitally transform or trying to scale their systems, what is increasingly becoming an issue is then how to secure those systems. So, and going back to that sort of accessibility versus security, what ends up happening is the more accessible you make a system, inherently the less secure it is. So, and to put this even sort of more plainly, I've seen environments, for example, Fortune 500 companies who say, they're like, look, we have this super secure financial information that only 10 people in the organization can view. Well, but we want to be hosted on the cloud, but yet that's sort of like against this idea. Like, and traditionally it was like literally they had the computer in a room, and the only way you could access the computer, it wasn't connected to the internet, was to be in that room. And so now that's obviously a challenge to scale, which is, the idea of having somebody to physically have to go into a computer room to access system is I mean, it's almost childish when we say it today, right? But there's an actual there might be an actual business reason for that that capability. And so now we're saying, well, we want all the advantages of cloud and being able to just spin a server up and be able to jump into that and get the data, when I'm sitting on a beach in Mexico. But I also want to have all the security of lockdown that I had before. And so in some ways, every sort of like 2 steps that you take forward on progression of digital transformation, you almost inherently take a step backwards to go and ensure that it's secure. And I think, some just like really simple, obvious things that we've seen, and probably the most classic one I've seen in the last couple of years is people who, they migrate to AWS and they leave their AWS has a service called S3, which just stores sort of physical files. And one of the most common issues with that is people just leave them open so that somebody can just go scan AWS and say, hey, I don't know, Home Depot has a bunch of files sitting there and they're not locked down. And it was used for an internal system that the system itself was locked down, but then the service that stores the media wasn't. And so somebody could just pull the sensitive information down. And like, this was like this. So this is just a great example because S3 has like this, it's got petabytes of information in it. So even at a single client, they may even have up to terabytes of information stored on there. So all of a sudden we have this great service that like scales almost like infinitely. Now has like this just inherent like issue with it, which is like, it's sort of just open if you don't lock it down. So it's like, yes, on one hand, we have this new tool that gives us the scalability, but likewise, it just gave us this massive hole in our security capabilities. And so this is all going back to the point that I initially made, which is like security is the thing that tells you can't scale anymore, because it's just, it doesn't want you to scale, because the easier it is to scale, the more prone and the more attack vectors you're opening yourself up to.
That's super interesting. I never connected those dots before, and it's also, it's also potentially connecting the dots of just flexibility. You talk about scale and how to be secure, you're inherently creating sort of a tension between scale and security. But it's the same with flexibility, I would assume, where if you want flexibility, whether you're growing or not, although chances are you're probably growing if you want that flexibility, it's going to be harder to have that sort of flexibility within your operations, your infrastructure. At the same time, you're tightening down security. Would that apply there as well?
Yeah. And that's a little, I mean, in some ways, what I'm referring to is flexibility is synonymous with that scalability, right? So the ability to go and adapt your environment into the new environment of the world, and having that flexibility and agility to do so. Yeah. Every step that you want to take towards doing that is having to keeping in mind of what security means.
Interesting. Huh.
A great example, if I don't know if you're aware, I mean, so Google, I think it was, I want to say almost 5 years ago now. So like the traditional way of locking down a system and a corporate system was that it would just sat behind the firewall, right? So, and the traditional view of security, or corporate security corporate IT security was, as long as it sits within the firewall, like nothing can get in, right? Or nothing can touch a system. And so Google, I think about 5 years ago, said, look, in order for our client or our employees to be able to work, like we don't really have a shield that sits around our corporate function anymore. So there's no actually, like, you don't firewall in if you're an employee at Google. They rely on two-factor authentication for their systems, and so you're just authenticated against your identity. Obviously, there's a little bit more advanced components to that, but the point is you're not VPNing into the corporate LAN to then be able to access systems anymore. Now they might use VPN to whitelist themselves into certain systems, but the point is that that sort of traditionalist view is being changed, and now actually that is where some of the flexibility is. But the complexity of that is incredible, and only a company like Google at this point has been able to do that. Well, I shouldn't say the only. They're an organization that can do that because of how they're set up.
Interesting.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the 2021 Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us, or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how to take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Deep inside, it makes me wanna say, "Help me to bring back."
Shifting gears a little bit, I want to talk, maybe hone in on this M&A concept a bit more, even though a lot of what we've been talking about is involved M&A, or that's part of where the angle we've come at it from. But the question I had for you is, what are some of the biggest challenges that we haven't already talked about when you're integrating IT as part of a a merger or an acquisition integration. So in other words, company A goes out and acquires company B. You've got two IT departments now. You've got to figure out how to put those two IT departments and capabilities together. What are some of the biggest challenges you see in trying to do that with some of these M&A situations?
So a couple things. Just as a general one, I kind of alluded to this a little bit. Technical debt and legacy technologies that are unsupported are very commonplace. We see that a lot. And so what ends up happening is, let's say that there is a merger or an acquisition from a portfolio company or just, a corporate company that wants to acquire. If their systems, the parent company itself, are not sort of up to par, and then they go and acquire and they're trying to consume something into theirs. So that's usually a challenge. Then the other challenge then is they go look at the acquisition and they say, okay, hey, look, these guys have a certain system. How do we then bring them under our wing and under our kind of platform? You mentioned about skill sets. So skill sets are always a challenge, and understanding how you might be able to do that. I think what's been very interesting in my experience is that, like, somebody who might have been working as a CIO or IT manager, VP IT, whatever the title is, they may be very exceptional and very good at what they do in terms of that sort of strategy and execution. But when they then have to go and acquire another business and they've never actually been in that situation, it can be incredibly daunting. And not for a lack of trying or skill set or whatever, but simply just because they haven't done it before. And frankly, that's why consultants exist. And I as a consultant myself, I'm actually very anti-consultant. But this is actually one of these situations where there's just so few people who actually have been in the trenches of an acquisition and then kind of gone through what the complications are, that expertise is incredibly valuable. Because there's so much nuance that you have to like appreciate, and at the end of the day, what ends up happening is you're really just dealing with like two organizations that are almost foreign to each other that then have to sort of come together and marry themselves up. And so if you're really good at being like, hey, I know I can stand up an ERP system and I know how to talk to the business and blah, blah, blah. But if you don't know how to like bring another organization into yours and do that in a delicate way, but also a meaningful way, that's not an easy task to do. So I think like those are some of the biggest challenges. Security is by far the hardest one. I would say the most difficult. Everybody gets it wrong, and I don't blame them. I think it's because you might have your corporate security set up in one way. You go and acquire another business, and you realize their security is very lackluster, and now you have to bring them under yours. And you've just spent all these years and months trying to train your people how to do the right thing, and now you have this least common denominator that might be smaller, but that part gets attacked, and it might have implications on you as an overall entity. So you now all of a sudden have to get that company up to speed. So there's just the complexities of it are not short. And I think at the end of the day, as human beings, especially in IT, we always like to be more ambitious than we think, or more confident about our capabilities. And I think it's a very difficult thing to do, and getting beyond that sort of idea that, hey, this is easy. We can just take their system and pull it in ours. I mean, it always takes, 1.5 to 2 times as long and costs 1.5 to 2 times as much.
Yeah. Yeah. And I've read plenty of studies. I'm sure you've seen the same ones about M&A integration success rates, or failure rates more specifically, and how, 80% or so fail in the integration efforts. And the same is true for digital transformations, by the way. But any sort of massive change like that, companies just don't have a good track record with.
Yeah. Well, and my favorite thing to pose to everybody when those statistics come up is, what's your definition of a success or a failure? Because nobody ever really likes to talk about that.
Right.
And to me, actually, that is part of the reason why they, statistically, let's say, succeed or fail, is because the definition of success never was established at the beginning. A successful, for example, outcome for an acquisition might be that you're going to decommission the whole thing, because it doesn't make sense to continue to operate on a system that is not fit for purpose or has technical debt or whatever. And so success might actually look like something very different. Whereas if somebody wanted to go, well, let's say they integrated the system completely, it worked perfectly, but the business all of a sudden couldn't ship half their, products, let's say, sure, it's successfully integrated and the company now is running on that system, but the business, let's say, took a 5% revenue hit or whatever.
Yeah.
That's not success to me. So I think that's, to me, actually the biggest thing that is helpful going into those is, and this goes back to IT strategy, which all starts with what's the business strategy, and M&A is no different. You have to understand why you're actually acquiring the business and what it's going to mean for the business, and then IT can follow that story and support it.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a brilliant comment, and I totally agree on the definition of success versus failure. I think that's where a lot of companies get tripped up, and they focus so much on let's implement on time, on budget, and that's going to define success for us versus, well, what was your overall value? What was your overall ROI? And I think if a lot of organizations were honest with themselves, I think a lot of companies that said they were successful or think they were successful in their transformations would actually find that they weren't successful because they left so much value on the table, or they disrupted the business more than they needed to, failed to realize the opportunities or the upside in a way they should have. It's a good point. What about data? Is data, I would imagine, and this is just based on, we work with a lot of clients, a lot of them, a fair amount of them are involved in some sort of M&A integration, or in the past they've been through an M&A integration, but a lot of them haven't been through that. But of the ones that we've worked with that have gone through that sort of integration, data is a pretty big deal as far as just sort of cleaning it all up and reconciling master data and having a unified way of speaking, for lack of a better word. Is that a big thing that you guys look at, or a challenge that you see in these sorts of integrations?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, at the end of the day, like, one of the things, I'll give you a great example. Like, we had a client that did a big software roll up, and it was interesting because they were like, oh, we're going to buy all these companies in this one space, and they're sort of industry specific ERP systems. And we're like, well, why do you want to do that? And they said, well, we're able to sort of realize some synergies by doing that, and we can cross sell. That was one of the big points. And so my sort of immediate reaction was, well, in order for that sales team to be able to cross sell, they have to know who the other customers are and if there's any crossover of customers. And it took them like 2 years to just even realize that, like, there was let's say they had 10 companies. Across the 10 companies, they shared 15% of them all had common customers. Well, the reason that they were so challenged to be able to figure that out is because they didn't really actually have a definition of who their customer was. And I know that sounds silly, but actually this is much more common than you think. And so when we then think about data and why data is so important is because in order to realize some of those objectives, in order to do a cross-sell opportunity, so if, let's say my client is, I'm going to pick up Walmart, right? And I've now have 6 companies that have software, or that provide software, and I find out 3 of them are selling to Walmart. Well, that fourth one, if I didn't know that, and I could have cross-sold it, and the sooner I was able to realize that, the sooner I'm able to actually realize the value of the acquisition. And so one of the common terms that actually is starting to be termed, I would say, in private equity and sort of advisory around private equity is this phrase called delivering deal value. And it seems really silly that consultants actually have to go out and tell people that are making acquisitions how to gain the value of the deal. But there's sort of two issues with it. Sometimes the value of the deal doesn't really get understood at the beginning, which is one part of just digging in and being like, hey, there's a serious opportunity. By the way, the company you're buying is sitting on this treasure trove of data. And then 2 is actual execution of that and saying, okay, how do we actually take that data and harmonize it into our own? Well, I can tell you, like, 9 times out of 10, the company that's doing the acquisition probably doesn't even have their data in a good enough format and situation. And can't even define its own way of what revenue is or sales is. And again, it sort of goes back to a lot of basics. It's unbelievable what advantages you can have by saying like, hey, look, I know what a customer is for us. I know what a sale is for us. And so when we go to look to acquire, I want to go and take those same metrics, and we're going to actually impose our definitions with some thoughtful exercises, but impose our definitions so that when we do say, hey, how do we cross-sell? I have the data there, and then I can report on it, and then I can make a decision to be able to actually realize some of that deal value, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. It sounds so basic, but in some ways it's not. And it has such high value though, too. I mean, if you can get that part right in that situation, that has a huge amount of value.
Yep.
Yeah. So a couple more questions just in the time we have with you here. What about when it comes to just trends in the market? This is probably a good sort of a capstone question for you. When you look at all the different trends in the market, and we've covered a lot of them here. We've talked about a little bit about cloud. We've talked about obviously M&A activity picking up. That's sort of a general trend that's happening more and more. I know I alluded to supply chain related issues. That's another trend that may not be a good one, but it's a change in the industry as far as supply chain struggling right now to keep up with demand. You have changing consumer behavior and changing demand for different types of products that's changing. Well, you just look at overall trends across the board, as it relates to IT capabilities and supporting growth of organizations. What are some of the trends that aren't the coolest necessarily, but are the ones that are most relevant, you think, to high growth organizations that you work with?
So what's interesting is, business process automation has been talked about forever. Mm-hmm. I think the modern version of business process automation is like, I believe the name is now escaping me, but I think it's RPA, that's a robotic process automation, right?
Yep, that's right.
And what's really interesting about it, and I understand why it's trendy, and can appreciate why organizations want to make those investments. And ultimately what it comes down to is that for a lot of organizations, there are repeatable tasks that happen day to day. And I think what is happening is we're starting to get a little bit more intelligent with actual software as opposed to just implementing software about how to take those repetitive processes and then either enable them or just purely automate them away. And so like a lot of the RPA tools and stuff are quite interesting from that perspective, is not only the actual ability to do some of it technically is super interesting, but I think what's even more interesting is being able to identify and understand what does a business process look like, and then how do I actually sort of automate that to the point where it's like I shouldn't have to do the same thing, the same identical thing over and over again. And I think that is an area that we're starting to see is like it's been talked about for a long time. It is a little bit shiny, but I also think like people are ignoring just like the basic things of like, I've seen a lot of distribution and manufacturing companies who they get orders through an Excel file that gets sent over and an email. And so being able to like, and nobody likes to talk about this stuff because it's like actually a little bit difficult because that's still the way a lot of businesses operate. And so being able to sort of take that capability and then automate it, but still do it in a way that sort of like keeps that manual step there almost in a sense, because it's like, well, this part of the market still is doing this thing. And so we just need to like have the technology adapt to it. It's like less sexy, but it's actually like drives incredible amount of value, right? Yeah. Like I've actually thought about for the longest time, just like building a simple tool that just takes an email inbox and then just scrapes the Excel file that comes in for order management, and then just building an API out of it so that it can be sent to an ERP system. Because like I just see that all the time, right? And so it's just like stuff like that where it seems so simple, but it's actually simple because the process is simple, but nobody really wants to go and automate it away because the market's all saying like, hey, you need to be like Google and have like everything done by AI. And it's like, well, AI is not going to solve that. Like, this is something that is repetitive that you can just put a simple process in for.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people forget that there's oftentimes lower hanging fruit than going through an entire. And I know that technically is part of a digital transformation, what you just described. If you were to go in and create that app or build a application that could scrape those incoming emails, create a customer order or sales order, that is technically, I guess, somewhat of a digital transformation. But I think a lot of times companies get so enamored by, well, let's go, switch everything in our organization over to the cloud. We're going to go with a single ERP system, and they don't say this or think this, but they throw the baby out with the bathwater. They're going to try and rip everything out and replace it all. Whereas, sometimes we'll come in and say, well, do you really need to replace your system? Your vendors may be telling you should, because they want you to upgrade to their newest cloud solution or whatever. But what if you spend less money and got more value out of something like that? And I think a lot of organizations forget that, sort of the easy answer, the easier answer, I should say.
Yeah. And I think, look, as I said, I can empathize a lot with CIOs, because in fact, I've a couple of the ones that I'm pretty close with, they're bombarded with emails from people selling them all these shiny new tools. And I have to kind of pause have the conversation with them to say, look, pause. It doesn't matter what this shiny new tool can do. It's what is the business problems that you guys have that you can actually put tools in for. Trying to go and launch an e-commerce site for a distributor is a daunting task. It's not easy. But finding areas, as you said, like quick wins, actually can be somewhat easy. And what it can do then is provide a learning process for you to then enable other systems and processes that you didn't think were capable there. And then, by the way, if you want to go and launch the e-commerce project, it becomes that much easier, because now you have a business and an IT organization that's enabled to actually successfully implement those projects. One, identify them, and then two, actually implement them.
Right. Yeah, absolutely true. Yeah, it builds that momentum. Not only do you get the immediate value of something like that, but it builds that momentum to where you could then start to get a little more confident, get your legs underneath you, and go start to tackle bigger or more complex issues than that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, this has been a great discussion, Mike. Really appreciate you joining us on this live stream and the discussion here today. And this is really good stuff. And like I said, I think so much of what you've talked about, even the examples you gave related to M&A integration and more M&A specific activities or issues, I think so much of that can be applicable or should be lessons for small, mid-sized, high-growth organizations that maybe aren't even thinking about M&A right now, but it could still, a lot of those principles apply across the board. So I really appreciate some of the insights you shared here today.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks for being here, Mike. That was a great discussion, and there's a lot to unpack there. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk to Paresa and Kyler more about some of these themes that we heard here today. And also later in the show, we're also going to have Nate Stroeher from Third Stage Consulting. He's going to be talking about change management in more detail, so you don't want to miss that. So we'll be right back after a quick break.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstageconsulting.com.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. We just had a discussion here with Mike Bestvina from Renna Partners, talking about high-growth situations and IT within those high-growth situations, mergers and acquisitions. Covered a lot there in that conversation. What were some of your observations, Kyler?
Yeah, I think, obviously some great information and some great tactics if you are going through any sort of transformation where you're combining two different companies, whether it's actual merger and acquisition, departments, anything that you can kind of take away there. I think it's a great partner piece of content to our new ERP due diligence reports for our private equity clients that we just finished a large white paper from our Vice President of Europe, Stuart Robb. So we can go ahead and link that below. That's a free download. And then he's also going to be touching on a lot of this at our PE boot camp in September as well, that he's hosting with the private equity UK partnership that we have. So that reminded me a lot of kind of the different pieces that we go through when advising clients, both big and small, that are going through any sort of transition in which they need to kind of combine or intertwine different cultures. But what about you, Paresa? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think agreed. Lots of great resources. He made a lot of good points too that kind of made me stop and think about how, again, things are just changing so much. And to dive into a couple of those, I mean, the first one that stood out was kind of the comfort that we're finding ourselves in because of technology. And he specifically alluded to CIOs and IT leaders not really thinking about the basics like they once did. And he used the example of something as simple and straightforward as backups and recovery, and how, a lot of the partners that we bring on and a lot of the technologies that we bring on, it's these pieces are, I guess, taken care of already. Everything's already, accommodated to the point where you don't need to be thinking about the basics. And it's true across everything. It's true across this scenario. It's true across, how much technology is entering our day-to-day lives even. It's not making us lazy per se, but kind of making us lazy. So I don't know. It made me think, obviously you want to still keep those foundational elements top of mind, but is it necessarily a bad thing to, give that power, I guess, to the cloud technologies that you're bringing on or to the different partners that you're bringing on to take care of the little things for you so you can focus more big picture? Is it a bad thing? What would you say, Eric?
I'd say it's mostly not a bad thing for most organizations. I think there's still a lot of trepidation or fear around that idea for that very reason, the way you described it, because I don't necessarily want to give up control. And that's true for, I think, for a lot of leaders or CIOs that are managing this sort of change. But overall, I mean, I think most organizations that are not in the technology space would agree that their core competency is not, and maybe it shouldn't be, IT and IT maintenance. Now, there's a fine line there because you don't want to outsource everything. There's certain ways that IT is sort of a commodity, I don't want to say non-value add in a bad way, but it's not your core competency, so you want to outsource that. That's true for big parts of IT like backups and disaster recovery and things like that. But in other ways, IT can be a strategic differentiator in a way that you may not want to outsource it or move it all to the cloud or use a generic system to manage your business because that waters down your competitive advantage. So you look at an organization that, maybe I think it's a combination of both. They might find some things they just want to outsource and get off their plate because it's not their core competency. It's not adding a ton of value. Someone else can do it better than you can as an organization. But then there's other things that you want to refocus or redirect your time on that can be. And a lot of that's more application based or more operational based. If we can create some competitive advantage with better technologies or something that is different or better than what our competitors and peers are using, then in that case, you may not want to move everything to the cloud or outsource it. You may want to actually have a tighter control over that. So I think it can be a combination of both, but there's certainly an opportunity there, though, to your point, to Mike's point, to reduce costs and sort of get rid of some of those non-competitive advantage types of things, or not get rid of them, but get them off your plate.
Right. So you can focus on kind of I keep going back to the bigger picture pieces, but there's just so many other things that go into it. It makes sense. And you kind of mentioned it as well, but I mean, today, business and IT, it's just so intertwined. You can't run a business without tech. I mean, there's like no going back at this point. We're only moving forward with how integrated technology is in any type of business, whether you're in retail or, what have you. So I guess my question is, have you seen any cases with clients where you come to the table and their business vision and their business strategy is not necessarily in alignment with their IT strategy? So, for example, are they, they have these big goals to reach target A, but their IT is either, not appropriate for the trajectory that they want to go on, or it's subpar, or just something where those two strategies, business strategy and IT strategy, are misaligned.
Yeah, it's extremely common, and more common than people probably realize. And if you think about the dynamic of how organizations get misaligned between their business strategy and their IT strategy and the way they run IT, it's a lot of times that people don't see that there's a direct connection there. There should be a direct connection, or at the very least, you should recognize that even if you don't deliberately try to connect the two, you have to recognize that if you don't connect the two, one can undermine the other. So a lot of times what happens is you get a CIO or IT director that'll come in to an organization. They come in new and they've got a vision of what they think IT should be. And they might have a vision of, say, going with your example before, let's move everything to the cloud. Let's use, best in class vanilla software off the shelf, that because that's maybe the way they grew up, or that's just their philosophy of how to run IT. And that's not necessarily good or bad just on the surface, but if they're going into an organization that is super flexible and entrepreneurial, and they value speed and being nimble and being able to react quickly, that doesn't necessarily fit well with this whole idea of just push everything to the cloud and use vanilla software off the shelf. You sort of have to know where to bend a little bit, or where to take that, in that example, take that IT strategy and mold it to the business strategy rather than the other way around. Because what ends up happening otherwise is the IT guy or gal comes in, goes with their philosophy of what they think the world of IT should look like, and it somehow undermines or holds back the ability to achieve the business strategy. And that's extremely common. And that's what we, again, back to my point earlier about how everything I talk about usually will somehow come back to change management. That's what we call misalignment. When you have misalignment within an organization, that's a change management issue. And that's something that ultimately you want to make sure you hire people that are aligned and have the same vision and can kind of head in that same direction. But inevitably, people get misaligned because we're all different. So it's a matter of making sure from a change management perspective, we address that misalignment to get people as close together or rowing in the same direction as much as we can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to build on that, we had a great presentation that I learned a lot from our business ops consultants at Third Stage that talked about our clients asked a lot of times, like, who should be on our ERP core team? And a lot of times they see that as just a technical aspect. But when, our clients come to us and ask that, we often say, you need someone from your sales team, you need someone from your accounting team, to really see the full lens of the overall business, because it is a true transition for the organization. And then I also learned a lot about how important they are to include in testing. And we actually heard that from Marcus Harris, who is an attorney that specializes in the ERP failures when they do get to, that terrible place of litigation. But the fact of how important it is to test across the business and not just with your IT sector.
Yeah, this end-to-end testing and making sure that it's all cross-departmentally. I mean, everything that your ERP or any new software is touching should be tested. That is, I feel like, from what I've heard, a key to making sure it works before go live.
Yeah, and so important for your vendor contracting, right? Which Marcus brought up a great point about when you are, going through this with either your vendor or your system integrator, and including that in the actual contracting. So if, God forbid, anything were to go wrong, that was a huge place in which they always found holes in that actual contracting piece. And I never really thought about how important that was from a business transformation. I always assumed, ERP, IT project, maybe a few other people would need to be involved in the conversation, but that's truly not the case.
Yeah, Marcus is a genius. We should have him back on the show. He was on our episodes of, I think it was the earlier episodes, right, Eric?
Yeah, it was like
on
the
a
second
couple of
episode and maybe the fifth one or something like that is early on. But I do have it on our to-do list to reach out and bring it back on the show because it always has something new to share and different perspectives on different situations. So,
Yeah, and it's important stuff. I mean, how you start a project and how you protect yourself against these big players. I mean, it can make or break your situation. So, another thing too that stood out to me with Mike's conversation is cybersecurity. And I'm just fascinated by cybersecurity, especially in this day and age, because I just feel the rate of technology growing versus how quickly we are adapting to these cyber threats all around us. It's so important. And the conversation specifically around scaling your business and scaling your systems, as it relates to growing your business, I mean, it sounds like you are kind of, you give and take a little bit. The more you grow, the more accessible you need to make your systems. But the more accessible you make your systems, the less secure it becomes. You know, he made the great point of you can be super secure and have a computer room and go to that specific computer room and only 10 people on your team can log in that room, and you'll be super secure. But who wants to do that, especially in a world of remote workers, right? I mean, 2020 was a huge catalyst for pushing the workforce remote. So if you want that flexibility and ambiguity, you got to give or take a little bit. So there's a trade-off happening with just how much the workforce is changing and the rate of remote work, and then inherently security is going to decrease. So I guess, is there a way to do this without having to give and take? Can you still be flexible and scale your systems without compromising security?
I don't know. That was, anytime we do these interviews, there's always, I love doing the interviews because there's always something new you learn and whatnot. There's always some eye-opening points in every conversation we have in these podcasts, in these interviews. But that was one of the bigger ones that I feel like it sort of hit me in the head. Like, wow, how did I never connect the dots between those two? That comment you just made, that never occurred to me in my entire career. So that was a pretty eye-opening moment to hear him say that. And it makes so much sense. I mean, as he said, I was like, oh yeah, that makes total sense. It kind of reminds me a little bit, by the way, of really any decision, any major decision you have to make, even outside of digital transformation. If you just back up and look at running a business, or if you're an executive that has an executive team that you're managing, or if you're any sort of leader, you've got different people with different perspectives, different skill sets, and they all, a lot of people are going to have different perspectives of, in my little area, my domain, this is what we should do. And then someone else, the two of you might have a totally different perspective based on your domain. And if I'm a leader, I've got to decide, well, okay, I'm getting 3 different data points here and 3 different, sets of pros and cons, and I've got to decide what the right answer is. And they don't necessarily, none of them are right or wrong necessarily, but I've got to balance that out. So I think that's true here with the whole cybersecurity versus flexibility and openness sort of trade-off. That's just one more trade-off that we have to manage or figure out where we're going to fall. Because I think in today's day and age, it's really easy to default to, and I tend to think this way too, and that's why I think I didn't connect the dots, is you tend to default to, well, cybersecurity is becoming more and more of a threat, especially since COVID. It's become more of a threat. We had Daryl Crockett on a few episodes ago, early in the inception of the show. She talked a lot about cybersecurity, how important it is, and I think we all agree on that. But it's easy to default to, let's just lock everything down. Let's just get cybersecurity as tightened up as we can, without really thinking about, well, what's the trade-off there? And it's just like any decision during a transformation or when you're defining your digital strategy. There's always trade-offs, there's always pros and cons, and you've got to figure out what makes sense for your organization and what your priorities are. And it may be that if you're a government institution or a banking institution or some other organization that has extremely sensitive, high-value information, it may be that, yes, cybersecurity is a number one or a very high priority, and you're going to sort of defer to cybersecurity, and you're going to make the compromises you need to make as an organization to allow that or enable that. But if you're a super entrepreneurial company, you're growing really fast, cybersecurity is always a risk, but maybe it's not as much of a risk for that sort of startup as it might be for a bank or a government institution. Not that you totally set aside cybersecurity, but maybe you do it smartly, but you also don't do it to the point where you might slow down or undermine the other priorities you have. So I don't know that there is a way to do that. I mean, just based on that discussion with Mike, and also just based on the fact that, like I said, transformations have so many different trade-offs that can't coexist necessarily. You have to decide one or the other, or decide where on a spectrum you're going to fall. I feel like this is just one more that falls into that bucket of trade-offs we've got to make. So I don't think there is an easy, either or sort of answer.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I feel like you hit the nail on the head. It would just be prioritizing, depending on what you do and who you are as a company, and that would define where you fall on the scale. It's interesting to think about, though, because it totally makes sense. It's very like after he said it, it was a common sense nugget, right? But it was the same reaction for me. I was kind of taken aback, like, wow, that's interesting. It's just another thing you have to be mindful of as you scale. Yep. And then another thing too, I mean, I remember a few episodes ago, Eric, we were talking about a specific client. I think they were in Dubai, that was acquiring companies left and right. And in those situations, I mean, you're acquiring companies and you're also acquiring different systems, right? It just comes with the territory. So when you have one company that's, say, on like MD365, and one company that's using Oracle, and one company that's doing SAP, like, how do you decide, first of all, which system should be the parent system? And then where do you go from there? I mean, can you operate when all these different companies are on different systems, or should the end goal be bring everybody onto the same system so everything can be a little bit more seamless?
Yeah, that one, that's a age-old question. I don't think that debate's ever going to get settled anytime soon, because I think I could argue both sides of that. I think there's a common misunderstanding or misconception that an organization like that should consolidate their systems. But I don't know that that's necessarily true. We have a lot of clients where they intentionally don't consolidate all their systems because it's not the end of the world. If you have multiple systems, okay, that's not terrible. I'm sure it creates some pain, and every organization that has multiple systems has their own challenges trying to integrate and trying to manage data and trying to act like one company. But if you're a semi-decentralized company, or you're a diversified company, or you have different parts of the organization that intentionally are operating differently because you want to be closer to the customer, or you want to be regionalized or localized to wherever they're operating, then it may not make sense to consolidate onto one system. It may be okay to have multiple systems, because either way, no matter what you do, you're still going to have a lot of challenges you have to deal with, a lot of risk that you're just trading off one for the other. If you go to one single system, that may sound great, but now all of a sudden you've created a more common operating model. You've consolidated your data. You've consolidated your IT spend. That's all great. But now you've put all this pressure on the operations of the organization that may create more risk than you've fixed by consolidating systems, because now maybe you're watering down or undermining all the stuff that has made you successful as an organization. And now you can't respond as quickly as you used to, or, you can't meet some of the specific business requirements that you have throughout the organization. So you just have to really make sure you go in and understand that no matter which one you do, which path you take, you just have to understand where the blind spots are, what the dark side of that path is, because there are going to be big risks. So I honestly don't have a strong preference. I usually don't go into clients, and neither does our team. We don't really care what direction a company goes, and we don't really think that there is a best answer. But there usually is a best answer for any individual organization, and that's the key: is what makes the most sense for you.
Yeah, and I think that kind of goes back to that change management plan, right? In going into, all right, how is this actually affecting our culture? Not only have we acquired this company, we've changed, hierarchy in the company, we've changed jobs, and now we're going to go in and change the system. And how will that kind of create that shock factor, which affects the ROI and disruption in the overall business processes? So I think that kind of goes back to how do you create this awareness, which having a partner like Third Stage, or someone that can help you pull out these red flag areas to say this is something that you should consider, I think is incredibly valuable to just having that expertise when you go through this, because it can cost a lot of money to overhaul an entire system when you just bought the company, and then training and how are you going to make sure that is implemented successfully is a humongous task.
Yeah, absolutely. Either way, I mean, change management and how you bring this all together is absolutely critical. I agree with that.
And how does, I mean, tell me a little bit about what our team does, Eric, with specifically mergers and acquisitions. How do we guide companies as they acquire new companies and scale in this fashion?
Yeah, so usually we get involved as the integration is happening. You know, the reason I enjoyed having Mike on the show is because he's usually going in more from the due diligence perspective early on, and you know, not that that's the only time he gets involved, but they're seeing more of the pre M&A side of it than we typically do. So when we go in, usually it's more from the perspective of we've already acquired these other companies, or we've already grown to a certain point. Now we've got to figure out how we're going to bring this all together. So generally, what we do is not too dissimilar to what we would do with a company that hasn't gone through an M&A, which is first of all defining what is that overall strategic direction of the organization and how does that translate into what the potential transformation might look like. And then once you get into the actual transformation, that's where you start to look at, you know, what are the different operating models that you have, what's the inventory of the current state, and where are the pain points, where are the strengths, what are the opportunities for improvement, and ultimately what do we want to be when we grow up operationally, and how do we want those processes to work in the future. So that's one of the first pieces is that operational piece. And then you do the same thing with the technology landscape. You look at all the systems you have. What do you want to keep? What are the strong systems that make sense to keep? What are the ones you want to get rid of or consolidate or whatever? And then there's the other major component, which is the organizational assessment, looking at what all these different organizations look like. How are you going to consolidate or create, you know, common roles and responsibilities, or, you know, that organizational design type stuff. And then I'd say maybe a fourth one, or one of the four big ones that we look at in terms of the work streams or buckets, is on the data and reporting side of it. So what are we going to do with all these sources of data? How can we bring it all together? What's the business intelligence strategy? That's usually even more important for a company that's gone through a merger and acquisition, because usually they have such disparate data and information. They're trying to figure out how to pull it all together. And usually when there's a PE firm involved, or when you've got a new parent that's just acquired you, there's more pressure now to produce results and to prove results and prove value. So there's more eyes and ears on the data, or the business value that's being created. So that data and reporting becomes even more important for those organizations. So those are like the four big areas that we assess. And then from there, you figure out what's the roadmap forward based on whatever the assessment shows and whatever direction we want to go strategically.
It all comes back to change management.
Yeah, and Eric, I know you go into great detail on M&As in your YouTube videos. So if anyone in the audience is looking for more information on those, feel free to check out Eric's YouTube channel or the Third Stage YouTube channel. We have content regarding mergers and acquisition on both. Yeah,
good point. It's an interesting topic for sure. And again, I think the M&A stuff is relevant, certainly for PE firms and companies that have actually been through M&As. It's absolutely relevant. But even for organizations that aren't, they're just growing, or they're just trying to figure out how to scale. If you can take a lot of those principles and best practices from M&A situations and apply it to really any organization. That's why I like studying it and focusing on it so much, because it applies to so many different organizations, that even the ones that aren't going through M&A.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Right. Well, I'm looking forward to tuning into Nate's presentation too. Was it Full Throttle or Digital Stratosphere?
Actually, I don't recall. Which session was this? Do you remember, Kyler?
This was Digital Stratosphere. Yeah, but he recently did Full Throttle, where he moderated a panel. So definitely go check that out on our YouTube page too, because he had all of our change management specialists. So we interviewed Teresa and Julia on our change team as well. So a great piece to kind of follow up as homework to this one too.
Yeah. That
Lots of events. Well. Lots of events, lots of content. And this one was a really good segment too, that just kind of elaborates on the importance of managing people and managing change, especially during a transformation. So I know that he's going to cover a lot of what we're talking about here, even in more detail.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking forward to it. And really, the reason I wanted to show this clip at the end was so that I could prove to you, Paresa, that everything does come back to change management. And we're going to finish off the episode with this change management clip. But it was a great session, though, and I look forward to it. It's a presentation he gave at that event, and I think it's worth playing here in today's session, or in today's podcast. So we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll play you that clip, and then we'll come back after that, and we'll debrief and talk more about some of the findings from that discussion. So we'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
Here we go again.
aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. Glad you could be here today. Thanks for listening in. You can find us on all the major podcast platforms as well as YouTube, so be sure to check out past episodes if you haven't already, and be sure to subscribe, share this with friends and colleagues. We'd love to get the word out and get this information and content out to more people. So our final guest on today's show is Nate Stroeher. We're actually going to play you a clip from a previous event that we hosted where Nate gives a presentation talking about change management, best practices and strategies and frameworks that can be used to help manage change. And it's just a good, we've covered a lot of change management stuff on the show in the past, but this is a good structured discussion around how change management can be deployed to different organizations as part of their transformation. So I'm going to play this clip. It's a pretty meaty clip. There's a lot of content here, but I think you'll enjoy it. So we'll cut to Nate, and Nate, thanks for being here.
Quick introduction. My name's Nate Stroeher. I'm a director of digital transformation at Third Stage Consulting Group. I've had 15 years in specifically working in technology around ERP packages and digital transformation. I started my career at Deloitte Consulting, where we did more of the, we worked on a lot of the financial analytic systems, a lot of the big ERP packages, and traditionally worked with the Fortune 500, Fortune 50 companies. And most of our clients and our implementations were around the length of about a year to 2 years. And completed a lot of implementations from both a domestic and an international level. I've worked in the last 10 years, I've focused a lot more on digital strategy, organizational change, process improvement, and finance transformation and project management around the entire end-to-end implementation and change management piece. Today, I wanted to talk to you about organizational change, and I wanted to start off by taking a step back and just talking about kind of at the high level, what is organizational change and why we focus so much on change management and what are the advantages of change management. We'll go through today and talk about what the advantages are, why change management is needed, especially in today's environment. And I will finish up with some success stories and some areas that are common pitfalls that lead to more challenges among the change management initiatives. But really starting off, when we talk about what is organizational change, trying to define organizational changes is really at a high level, anything that's preparing people for the transformation and drives transformational performance. So to put that in more understandable terms, it's any initiative that will allow your people to change and take best advantage of the transformation that's going to take place. When we talk about change management, there's often the question, I have a good implementation team, I've chosen a good implementation provider, why should I take the time? Why should I invest in a change management initiative? Eric shared earlier, and I think it was a really good point worth repeating, that change management is often one of the most overlooked steps within a technology initiative and a data transformation initiative, but often is usually one of the most important factors towards guaranteeing or ensuring the better chances of success for the technology, not only at go live, but past go live and through to the optimization phase And as you continue to take advantage and move through your technology timeframe, it really puts everyone in the position that you're in a better situation to take advantage of what you've implemented. Starting with change is difficult and personal. People are comfortable with what they know. I think we can really look back at the last year and see that we've all been forced into a lot of change. I think that we're probably, everyone on this call is really tired with hearing about how we're going to have a new norm, how we're going to fall back into the normal way of life that we're all used to. But basically, I think this last year has really been a great example of how comfortable we are with change and how uncomfortable we are with what we don't know. Change management is really an attempt and a set of processes that will help people and bring the people, the processes, and the technology forth to take best advantage of your digital transformation and the technology that you choose in the future. Forced initiatives introduce many questions. Often with most of our technology implementations, we find that there's the common resistance of, how is my role going to change? How are the jobs going to change? Am I going to lose my job? Am I going to be asked to do something that I don't know? Is our team going to change? Am I going to report to a new boss? Are my skills outdated? And do I have to learn new skills? Do I have to learn new skills to keep my job? Or how can I change better to keep myself active and keep myself as an important part of a team moving forward with the new technology? We talk about when change and the difficulty with change. People change for many different reasons. The best way and the best chance to ensure success with people changing is when people are better able to change and better able to handle change when they understand and they believe in the new direction. We often hear the phrase, kind of blindly following a leader, blindly following a program. While that is sometimes a sign or is a method of ensuring success, really we find that when people understand where they're going, when they believe in where they're going and they know where they're going, there's much better chance for success and much better openness to change and much better to get into the flow of what this change means. Another way to ensure that that people will more clearly follow the direction of change and take best advantage of the change is to make sure that the orders that they're following from the leaders, that they are known and that they are understood. Again, kind of when we talk about that concept of follow blindly a leader, the chances of success are so much better, and people are more apt to adapt to change when they know what is the direction from the leader, when they are able to follow the direction from the leader, and when they trust in the leader and trust in the journey and the vision that's ahead. People are obviously when people are more excited to learn, they're going to be better suited for change. I think that just kind of goes without saying, but it's something that's really important here. When an organization is able to clearly define what the new change means, what the new change brings to not only the organization, to the individual, and when they're able to build excitement around that and they're able to show that, hey, something better is coming down the line with this new technology change, we're going to have a better situation when we're done with this, and we are all going to be better for not only the organization, but for ourselves. That creates excitement. That creates an attitude and an atmosphere where people are excited to change, they're interested in the change, and they have much less resistance to the change. What I mentioned earlier, and I think it's important to bring up here, is when we talk about change, there's always the positives of change, and then there's also the negatives. Oftentimes, change is a enabler for people to keep their jobs, for people to keep current in the organization, and for people to keep current in the new environment and the new technology environment that's being implemented and being considered. So when we talk about all the positives of change. We also talk about the motivation and the reason people change, and where they find that personal motivation often comes from just the fact that they need to change, they need to be current, they need to stay up with technology, and they need to think strategically to keep themselves in the position they're in and enable them to grow throughout their career and throughout the company. Obviously, the financial rewards, and we listed this last because this often is one that people think of initially and at the top of the list. When we talk about financial rewards, there often is not only the reward of the immediate implementation, and often companies will have success rewards, they'll have milestone rewards, they'll have timeline rewards, but there's really the reward of what this means for you as an individual and for the organization going forward. Will the organization be in a better position to achieve its mission and its goals? Will it be able to grow and think more strategically? And will the individuals within the organization be able to make themselves more valuable to the organization by taking advantage of the technology? Want to talk about really what are the initial challenges? What are the common challenges that we run into with change management, and why change management is in place is to address these challenges and to help organizations overcome these challenges and move forward with their technology that they've chosen and the path that they've chosen going forward. So first is intentional resistance. People are opposed to the change. They're they're outspoken about their resistance to the change. It typically is among the key stakeholders and influencers. There oftentimes happens that you will run into sabotage by these people, refusal to accept the changes, and this is one of the more obvious forms of resistance, but it's also one of the most difficult forms of resistance to deal with. What we try and do in our change management process is to initially address and try and figure out where this initial intentional resistance is coming from, try and address it early on, try and address it straightforward, and try and come to a common understanding of what is this resistance, why are the people that are opposed to this change, why are they opposed to it, understand what their motivation is, what their resistance is, and really try and figure out what it is that is making them act and feel the way they do. Often this is one of those steps that is very easy if addressed early on. It's very easy to handle, it's very easy to address, and it's often one of those that if you ignore it, and like we said on our last line, if you ignore it and you don't treat it head on, and if you don't treat it early on, it can spread like a cancer, and it can really undermine not only the entire organization's ability to adapt to the technology, but it can also affect the way an organization, the way the technology is used by the organization. So what we often say is when we are rolling out a change management plan, we're starting to work with the technology implementers to implement the technology, to make our change management plans, to write our training plans, to write our communication plans. We try and find out, where is that resistance? How do we address that? How do we get in front of these people that have this intentional resistance, and how do we bring it to the forefront and eliminate it, or at least address it before we move forward? The next form of resistance is a little bit more difficult, and I say it's more difficult in the sense that unintentional resistance is really one of those areas where it's harder to detect and it's harder to mitigate. We often talk about in our own personal lives, I just have a feeling that I just don't either understand this, I don't agree with this, or something just doesn't feel right about this. That's how I would describe unintentional resistance. People are opposed to the change that's happening in an organization. It's harder to detect, it's harder to mitigate, and it's really kind of harder to learn exactly what that is and how that is affecting the individuals within the organization. I often compare this to someone that just says, I'm going to go along with this. I'm excited about it, but there's just something that doesn't feel right. And while I'm going through the motions, I'm not putting my heart into it. I'm not putting 100% of my effort. This one the unintentional resistance is a lot harder to address, but there are very good methods and very good ways to get around this. And most importantly, the communication lines throughout the organization from the top down, the involvement in workshops, the involvement in the setup of the new technology, and really involving everyone at all points throughout this implementation phase and throughout this change phase will address more of this unintentional resistance. It'll make people more familiar with where the organization is going from a change point of view. It'll make them less uncomfortable with this change, and it will oftentimes mitigate what this resistance is. The third form of change and the third challenge that organizations encounter is misunderstanding. We'll talk about this when we talk about success factors later, but this is just a really common, and if I had to say, probably the most common form of resistance within change management, and something that we really need to address most often in every one of our clients. And really what this is just confusion with what the future state process, roles, responsibilities are going to be. It also is a misunderstanding with where the future of the organization can be. So when we talk about a change management process, we sit down and we say right from the beginning, where is an organization today? Where does an organization want to be in the future? And how will the change that we're going to be going through get us from where we are now to where we want to be? If that communication if that vision is not clearly understood and clearly communicated throughout the organization and understood throughout the organization, individuals will often misunderstand, or they'll often create a different version of where they think the organization's going. And that's where this misalignment happens. The resistance with this type of the challenge with this type of resistance is that often people don't know that they're resisting. They don't know that they're not going through with where the organization is trying to go. So they are often thinking, I'm well aligned with the goals of the organization. I'm well aligned with where we want to be. But really where their true north is versus where the organization's true north is are not the same things. And that resistance will slowly but surely pull the two apart. And then we talk about misalignment. So this is very, very closely related to misunderstanding. Misalignment is basically just when an organization is all going in the right direction, but aligning on how the individual pieces of that organization will get you there is not only not aligned, it could also be aligned perfectly, but it's not communicated, it's not understood, and it's not put into execution. So I often compare this to to use a sports analogy. It's often that all the players on the field know what the play is going to be, but there often is misunderstanding on what their role is to get them to where they want to go. Misunderstanding and misalignment are often the most common forms of resistance that we see, the most common challenges that we see within an organizational change, and really some of the easiest to mitigate through constant communication, through a well-known understanding, a well-known vision laid out by the leaders and understood by the individuals.
If you are involved in any sort of digital transformation or business change initiative, you will want to download the 2021 Digital Transformation Report. With its comprehensive overview of business and technology trends and best practices, this report is a must-have guide for any transformation project or executive team. Download this free report by visiting Third Stage Consulting at thirdstage-consulting.com. You can also visit our website to learn more about us or download independent reports, videos, and other best practices. Again, visit thirdstage-consulting.com today to learn how to take your transformation to the third stage of success.
Want to take a second here now to talk about the objectives of any change management initiative. We start out with, and with any clear change management initiative, we start out with two different pieces of the project. And you'll hear me often through this presentation, and as we go on throughout the week and dig deeper into our workshops, we're going to talk about what I will call the technology side of any change. And that is really just the nuts and bolts. That's the software you choose. That's the platform you choose. That's the environment, the technology environment you have. And then we talk about the change management piece. So from a change management piece, our first objective is to assess how ready is the organization for change. Often we have clients that are coming from technology that's anywhere from 10 to 15 years old. They have become very set in their processes. They're very used to the technology they have. While they're very excited for change, there is a lot of lack of understanding, lack of skill sets, and lack of knowledge of what the new initiative can bring them, what the new technology will bring them. So we really are trying to, at that beginning step, we're trying to say, how ready is the organization for change? How open are they for change? What skill sets do they have? What skill sets do they need? And what organizational changes will need to take place from a human capital point of view to get and to take an organization from where they are today to where they want to be and take best advantage of the technology. Then we talk about aligning executives and stakeholders. I alluded to this earlier, and this is really coming to an understanding, a clear understanding amongst the executive team on what their mission and what their goals are in a 1 to 3 year time frame, where they are now, where they're going to be, and how they're going to get there. That is often one of the steps that we find is the biggest challenge at the beginning of a project. Most of the executives feel like they have a good understanding of where they're going to be, where they are now, where they want to be, and how they're going to get there. But it's really getting everyone in a room, coming to a clear understanding, not only of where you are, where you want to be, and where you want to be in the future, but getting an alignment on how we're going to get there. What are the steps we're going to take? How will this new technology help us? What will this new technology not do for us? And so that once we get through this change, what will be the next 2 to 3 steps to get us to where we want to be as an organization? The third piece is really mobilizing your internal change agents. And this is really coming down to who are the people that are who are the most knowledgeable people within the organization, who are the people that are best with the technology, and really who are those influencers that are going to allow us to work throughout the organization, address the people that show the different stages of resistance, who are going to help us spread that vision, communicate the project, communicate what we're going to try to do. These are really your internal leaders that are going to basically help you with the change management process, put it in place, and lead from the inside for the change management going forward. Then we develop and execute a communications plan. Eric alluded to this earlier in saying that change management is far more than just communications and training. But I will say that with that being said, this is really one area, communications plan, that can really make a huge difference between a mildly successful change management initiative and an extremely successful change management initiative. It's really important to not only look at what your communication plan is, but how you will communicate with people. What will be the frequency of your communication? What mediums of communication will you use? Certain groups, as I spoke about earlier, will react to different communications different ways. Some groups will want to have live communication. They want to meet with their leaders. They want to either be on the same Zoom call or be in the same room. They want to hear where they are now and where they're going and how they're going to get there. Other people are very email oriented. They want a communication to come out every 2 weeks. They want to have their communication laid out in a certain format. They want bullet points. They want to know the highlights, and they don't want to read a lot of history around what's going on. They just want to know what's in front of them and what they need to do. And then there's a hybrid. There's people that are going to need sometimes to enjoy or sometimes they're going to need to have the live interaction. Sometimes they're going to need electronic interaction. Sometimes they're going to need to have town hall. Sometimes they're going to need to be involved in a presentation. It all varies depending on your crowd and depending on what part of the project you're on. So this is really a very important piece of this initiative to say, how are we going to communicate with the people? What mediums are we going to use? What frequency are we going to use? And what exactly is that message going to tell them? And then we basically assess and deploy the change impacts. This is basically saying, what are the impacts going to be on the organization and how will we address those going forward? When do we address those impacts? How do we address them? What is the change to human capital? What is the timing? What is the cost? And what is our plan to get through those change impacts? And then we design and deploy organizational changes. This is really kind of where the rubber meets the road. This is basically saying, okay, we have a communications plan, we have a change, we have a human capital plan, we have a training plan. Now let's go and put this in place. With those changes come changes to the process and the business processes. How are we going to do things differently? We've all seen in the last year that we've become a lot more accustomed to a remote workspace, and really as organizations now begin to come back to a more centralized work environment and to more of a hybrid setup, how are those business processes going to change? And when we go to a new initiative, a new change, a new technology, how will those business processes change, not only today, but when the new technology is implemented? Then we talk about the internal competencies and centers of excellence. This is basically just saying who's going to be the people, who are the subject matter experts, who are the individuals within the organization that we're going to look to make the decisions on how the software will be configured, how reports will be written, who will be responsible for communicating within the organization, what upgrades mean, what rollouts mean, what changes mean when the new software is implemented, and as you go through the upgrades going forward. And then we build the organization infrastructure to support the new processes and the technology. This is basically saying, okay, now that we know what changes need to happen with people, what changes need to happen with the process, how do we implement those? We talk about the ERP software training, but this is really kind of more of I would say a technology training. This is not only training the individuals for how they're going to use it, what the new technology is going to be and how they're going to use the technology, but this is also going to affect how they're going to do their daily job with other technologies as well, other automations. And it's basically looking at the whole environment. When someone sits down to their computer at the beginning of the day, how is it going to be different, not only from their new technology, but from the way they react with all the other technologies as well. Talk about train the trainers. That's fairly straightforward. This is basically going through and saying, we obviously will reach everyone that will be using the system, but we also have trained the trainers. We're going to train the trainers to help throughout the organization to make the decisions from an organizational point of view that will roll up to the overall organizational standpoint. But then it's really, how do we train these people to go through and be a daily resource to the organizations and to the groups that they're supporting going forward. Define and deploy performance metrics. So we talk about KPIs, key performance indicators, and this is a really important piece of the whole change management process. This is something that's often overlooked, and it's a very difficult piece of the process, but a very important one. And at a really high level, I'll leave it that it's very important from the beginning of a project to say, how will this new technology change the way we do business? How can we measure that? And how can we know that we are benefiting from the new technology? And how can we measure what we're doing today and how we're doing it in the future, so that we're constantly improving the way we're doing businesses, and we're constantly taking advantage of the new technology that we're implementing and the new organization that we're developing. When we talk about mitigating organizational people and risk, this is really addressing the resistance that's still in place and that occurs during the implementation and post go live. And this is really just saying, how do we not only take advantage of the people that have adapted this new technology and are moving forward with it, but then addressing what's holding us back, where is the resistance, not only where is the resistance, but where are people struggling, and how can we bring the people up to speed, how can we bring the organization up to speed, so that we're addressing what are the issues and what is keeping us from getting the most out of our technology. Then we go to the optimization phase, and this is really just going through and saying, okay, after a year or 6 months to a year after we've implemented the technology, we're comfortable with it. We've learned how to drive the car. How can we do it better? How can we take better advantage of the technology? Are there things that we're doing today that we could be doing better now that we have the new tools in place that will allow us to get to where we want to go? And then that really rolls into the post-implementation results. And this is really saying, we thought we were here, we thought we were going here. How close are we, and where do we still need to improve to get us to where we need to go? Kyler, is there any more questions that we can address?
Nate, real quick, will you kind of talk about what it means to have a partner in your OCM strategy and why that might be important outside the organization?
Yeah, I think having a partner, having an OCM partner, I think that it's real important to know that an OCM partnership really is something that is not only a partnership and it's not only an engagement that needs to happen during a technology change, but OCM is constant throughout an organization. So what we build into our change management initiatives is really a plan that's going to say, we're going to help you change to take advantage of the new technology we're putting in place and to help you redesign your organization. But we're really going to help you put this organizational change management function in place going forward. So you're going to see a lot more, and it's becoming a lot more prevalent these days, that organizations will have an actual organizational change management department within their group. So the organizational change management group will be responsible not only for implementing technology change, but it'll be organizational change. It will be helping the organization introduce new lines of business, helping them change to adapt to the changing workforce, the changing work situation as we've gone through this last year. So it's really important to have that partnership, but the partnership needs to happen internally and externally, and then it needs to continue internally after the project has gone live and after the implementation and third stage has left.
Excellent. And I know we will have you back at some point throughout the rest of the Stratosphere concert. I'm looking forward to the concert at the end of this. But you'll be talking about more specific tactics to a change plan and items like that, correct?
Correct. Yes. And so Well, we will go and what we'll address in our next session is not only the change management tool set, but then we will talk about some success stories, and we'll also talk about common points of failure going forward.
Excellent. And it looks like Dom down here had put a question regarding an OCM partner. Should they be different from a technical partner, or can they be the same? And are there any drawbacks of the SI/implementation partner also doing OCM?
Yeah, I think that my answer will be a very political, on the fence answer. I think it's definitely dependent. I traditionally, or I'll give you the benefits of both sides, Dom. When you have one organization that is handling both your change management and your technology implementation, those organizations traditionally work well, obviously, together because they are the same organization. They're going to be a lot more lockstep, and they will often offer you what I would call kind of a one-stop shopping that allows you to take advantage of their methodology from both a technical and a change management point of view. There's a lot of clear benefits to that, and I would say that we've seen a lot of success with one organization, Anderson Consulting or Accenture. Now they're a good example of, they're very heavily into change management, and they're very heavy into the technology implementation as well. There's a lot of success, and there's a lot of great things to come from that setup. I also say that it's good to have two different sides to the initiative, two different players coming in from a technology implementation and from a change management point of view, to constantly challenge each other, to constantly be working in the same arena, with the same mission in mind, but really coming at it from two different points of view, and really again, kind of challenging each other and keeping each other in check. So I think really the answer is probably yes, success in both areas, and there's probably some challenges in both areas, but I think it really depends on mostly who the implementation partner is and who is running the change management initiative.
Okay, great. Well, I hope you enjoyed that session with Nate Stroeher from our recent events talking about change management. We're going to talk more about this with Paresa and Kyler here in a second. We're going to take a quick break, and we're going to talk more about some of the findings and some of the threads that we picked up on during that discussion. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstageconsulting.com.
Welcome back to Transformation Ground Control. My name is Eric Kimberly, here with Paresa Noble and Kyler Cheatham. Glad to have you all here. And we just had Nate, or we played the clip of Nate giving his presentation at a recent event we hosted talking about change management. Paresa, what were some of your thoughts? What are some of the things that jumped out at you as you heard the conversation?
Yeah, well, it kind of goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this episode around culture. One of the things he mentioned is people are more likely to accept change when they trust the leader and they like the leader and they respect the leader, and when they're passionate about what they do and they actually like their job, right? If you have good standing with your company and you feel good about what you do, you're probably going to take more kindly to adjusting for them, regardless of the outcome. So I guess my question is, what about a company that's struggling in building their culture, or has kind of a subpar culture, if you will? Are they up against more resistance than a company that is, not in that position?
Yeah, most likely in most cases, yes, just because, if you aren't tracking culture, if you're not focused on it, if you don't understand it or whatever, it's a sort of own living being, living, breathing thing. It's going to do its own thing, and it's probably not going to be what you want it to be. I know that was, for me personally, that was one of the lessons I have in my career, is not focusing on culture. In my first company they started, that really created so many problems that just manifested itself in so many different ways that when I started Third Stage, that became the number one thing I wanted to focus on, was building a strong culture and making sure that the way we hired people, developed them, managed them, interacted with one another, make sure it was the kind of culture I wanted it to be, rather than one that just evolved into whatever it became. And culture is something that, just having learned the hard way, is something that just it'll evolve in a way that's probably not positive if you don't manage it. It's just, I don't know why that is. I'm not a psychologist or sociologist. I couldn't really explain it, but all I know is it's not something that manages itself. It doesn't just sort of self-correct or self-course correct the way you want it to. It's usually going to go, one of a million different directions that you don't want it to go. So I think the key is to understand what your culture is, first of all, because I think a lot of executives think, well, they don't even know where to start. If they're like I was, 15 years ago when I started my other company, it's like, what is culture? Like, what does that mean? I want to focus on what the business is going to be, not the culture. And so I understand why companies fall into that trap. But just because you don't know what it is doesn't mean you can't define it and articulate it. So if you can define and articulate what it is, and that'll help you understand what's good about that culture and what maybe you want to change and what you want to bend. But you have to articulate it first and define what it is. And a lot of companies have struggled to even do that. So that's the first step, is define what it is. And then from there, it becomes a little bit easier. Then you kind of see it like, okay, that's probably not what I want. There's some stuff here that I like, and there's some stuff here I don't like, and here's what I want to change, and here's what I want to look like in the future. So I think that's probably the biggest thing, is just understand what it is, and then you can define what it is you want it to be in the future, and then you build a whole change, cultural change plan behind that to help start moving the needle in the directions you want it to go.
Right. And I mean, any company that finds themselves with a subpar culture, if you will, would probably want to do what you just said. What about the companies that are planning to go through a digital transformation, and their team just doesn't like each other and everybody's mad? Should they first focus on trying to course correct their culture, or is that just kind of, should that be something that happens throughout the transformation, that they try to tend to it, or is it something that they should try to groom before they even open the door to a transformation project?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'd say we've worked with a lot of organizations over the years where they have political dynamics and infighting and cultural cancers and things that it doesn't matter how well you run a transformation in that environment, you're not going to succeed. You just can't, because the core foundation is just so corrupt, or not corrupt, but so cancerous and so toxic, and it's creating so many problems that no transformation can possibly succeed. So in those cases, you have to fix that stuff. But those are honestly pretty extreme cases. Every organization has political stuff, and they've got cultural warts and things that could be better. Every organization has that, but I'm talking about the really extreme ones that we've seen, that you definitely want to fix those first. But I think the more common thing you see is that organizations fail to realize that they're actually harming their culture by mismanaging a transformation. So they end up, if you go in and you manage a transformation in a way that is unrealistic, or isn't focused on the right things, or, like change management, or you're not focused on your people, you end up unintentionally creating a toxic or a cancerous culture. So you're kind of doing the opposite of what the intent was, because you aren't focused on culture, and because you're also because you're not managing your transformation the way it should be managed and the way you could be managing it. And so, you think of all the, examples of that we have from clients where they, for example, they set an unrealistic timeline for a transformation because the software vendor tells them you could do it in this amount of time, and they almost always underestimate the amount of time it takes. So then you draw a line in the sand, say, okay, we're going to implement in this amount of time. And that was an unrealistic expectation that never had any reality to it to begin with, but it becomes reality for your organization. Now you start forcing people into this unrealistic scenario, creating all this pressure and chaos and burnout and morale issues and all this stuff that's harming your culture. So it's sort of strange because on one hand you think, well, how can I improve my culture and what are the cultural transformational things I want to do? But you also have to look at just the fundamental stuff that you're doing as a transformation that might actually be harming your culture, and what can you do to not do that? So I think you have to look at both angles there.
Yeah, and Nate, especially in this presentation and a lot of his content, focuses on that need for transparency. Like you said, Paresa, at the beginning of this segment, that trust in that leader and that impact that can have. And then when you mismanage a transformation and are not transparent with your team and communicating what their new job description will be or the plan around helping them through this change, creates distrust within the organization. Nobody wants to work for a company they don't trust, right? That just feels wrong. So I think when businesses can take that transparency and really tackle that vulnerability with their people to say, this is the timeline, we're going to do our best to stick to it, this is what we're going through, then you get this lens of creating that trust between leadership and employee, and they're much more amenable to going through that change with you when they feel like they're a part of it, right? So,
yeah, that trust comment is a really good one, because it's amazing. Sorry to interrupt you. It's amazing how when you unintentionally create that distrust, like even the example I gave of the unrealistic timeline, no one did that. No one was nefariously trying to do something unrealistic, but it does create the perception that you, the leader, put me in this situation that I can't win, and you're setting me up to fail. You're setting us all up to fail, and therefore I don't trust you. So in 99% of the time it's unintentional, but it's so powerful, it's so negative. So it undermines.
Absolutely, and manifesting that fear in an already very scary situation by not having any controllables over what's happening with your job function, with your spreadsheet you've had for 25 years, and that can scale from a multi-billion-dollar global company to a family-owned small business. All of those tactics in the transparency of change plans and strategies are definitely a huge, huge impact.
Right, and it's being transparent too with the good, the bad, and the ugly. I think, like you said, stepping into the vulnerabilities and showing, we wanted to add this part of the system or enable this functionality, but for this reason we couldn't. Or even, just kind of laying it all out there and keeping everybody on the same page. I mean, to the extent that it would be constructive, I guess, right? You don't want to lay everything out there.
Overshare.
Yeah. But I mean, enabling your team and welcoming them into the process by just sharing those things is something that will build trust, even when it's something that maybe, you think that they don't need to know. It could benefit you in just letting them know, right? It's interesting.
Yeah, and that's a great point. And the good, the bad, the ugly, because it's when we get in these projects, there's a certain amount of self-preservation that happens where we tell people what we want them to hear, and then there's another piece of it is that you want to stay positive, and there's the optimistic side of us that is there's a good nature to it, but there's a dark side of that too. When we get too optimistic, don't look at what's really going wrong, and let's hone in on that and let's fix it. Not to dwell on it, not to blame anyone, but let's just fix it. And you can't do that without that transparency that you're talking about.
I mean, especially in today's culture too, because you look at even how people are putting ads out and every holistic approach to doing business, authenticity is taking the lead on everything, because I mean, we're living in an era of information. I mean, we just Google something and we can know whatever it is that we want to know. So having that raw, bare bones authenticity in everything you do, whether it be communicating your transformation plan or your marketing, I mean, lead with authenticity and usually it works out for you, is what I've learned at least. And another thing I was curious about was the metrics behind change management. We always talk about the importance of change, the strategies behind change, best practices. How can we measure it? What's a good way and a good metric to make sure that you are on track and doing it correctly through a transformation?
Yeah, that's a good question. The way, at the most fundamental level, the way we typically measure it and the metrics we use are related to, first of all, you have to take stuff that's very intangible and subjective and put it into sort of a quantitative objective format, which is, it's never clean, it's never easy, but we use a survey tool and a diagnostic that helps clients quantify different aspects of their culture. So it helps identify where the strengths and weaknesses are, and it also helps you track progress over time. So you might look at things like, and it's all perception based too. That's the other thing. It's not fact per se, but it is fact in some ways because it's perception, and that's what you're managing to, or what you're measuring. You're measuring what people's perception of communication and collaboration and management style, leadership. There's all these different dimensions that we measure in our organizational diagnostic or assessment, and that's probably the best way to do it, and the only way I know of to really measure something that's so hard to measure. So that's part of it. Is you have to sort of force yourself to take something that's intangible and touchy-feely and put it into more subjective or a more objective quantitative format. The other part of it too is everything in change management should tie back to business value and ROI. So you always want to be thinking about change management from the perspective of not just we want to do this because we feel like it's the right thing or we feel like people are going to feel better about it. You can certainly do that if the diagnostic shows that it's going to help move the needle, and it is moving the needle. Then yes, that may be true. But even more important is it helping add business value? Are we actually realizing the benefits we expected from the transformation? Are we getting the value from it? And even as you're going through the transformation, you may not know yet what that value actually is because you haven't had a chance to realize it, but you can at least think of change management from that measurable perspective of how are we going to increase efficiency or improve the customer experience if that's one of our goals or measures or whatever the case may be. So tying it back to the broader strategic goals, I think is important as well. Right.
That makes sense. I mean, you mentioned it, ROI. I mean, that's an easy low-hanging fruit. That should be how you measure almost everything that you do. But there's so many intangibles there that it's hard to quantify in a sense, but you have to find a way to do it in order to stay on track.
Yeah, and garnering both those qualitative and quantitative pieces of feedback. I know Nate always talks about, he has tons of content on how to measure change management. He's done it on our Digital Stratosphere podcast. He's written blogs on it and has a variety of videos on it on the Third Stage YouTube channel. I know in just monitoring our audience questions, we get questions all the time about how do I convince my senior management team that change management is a pivotal part of this overall digital transformation. And I think utilizing these metrics within the plan, how will we measure success, takes change management from almost a soft science to an actual tangible strategy. So I think it helps both on the front end in pitching it to your senior management team and making sure it's a part of your overall strategy, to the measurement at the end to see if your implementation is working.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have a good point about pitching the executive team, but also just educating them on what change management is, because so many people don't really understand it. So it starts with that, and as part of that education, you also want to make sure that you're aligned on how you're gonna achieve those change strategies.
Right. It's all important stuff. Okay, now to close out this conversation, I thought we could play another game. Eric, we played a game recently on an episode where it was like fire round. So this is going to be similar, and I'm going to ask you what the risks and benefits are of partner involvement in OCM. Nate kind of touched on, if you bring in a system integrator, can you give them the organizational change management strategy to spearhead? And I can guess what your answer is there. And, what if you do it internally? So I'm going to go through 3 different scenarios. The first being spearheading organizational change management internally, passing it to a system integrator, or getting support from a third-party independent consultant. So I'm going to list them off, and you give me 1 risk and 1 benefit. Speed round. Okay, are you ready?
Sounds good.
Okay.
I'm ready.
Let's start with system integrator, because I'm excited to hear your response to that one. Give me 1 risk and 1 benefit of passing organizational change management to a system integrator.
Okay. The risk is they focus too much on technology and just understanding how to use technology. The benefit would be that they know the technology really well, and they can train on the technology pretty well, typically.
Easy. Good answer. That was more mild than I was expecting.
Well, I mean, I have a lot of other thoughts that it wasn't directly related to your question. You didn't ask me what I think outside of that. If you wanted to keep going, I could, but it's a speed round. I'll keep it simple.
You're right. We'll save that for the next episode. All right. How about if a company were to keep it internal to their project team? What is one risk and one benefit?
Well, the risk is that they don't know how to manage change, or they don't have maybe a structured methodology and way of doing it. And even though you only asked for one, I'll give you two. The other big risk is that they don't see how to manage change just because they're internal, and you get blinded by just being part of it every day. You don't necessarily see with a fresh perspective on how to manage that change. But the benefit, the upside, is that you own the change, and that ultimately that's what you want. You want to own it. So it's a matter of how can you do that, but also address the risk.
Got it. Good answer. And risk and benefit of bringing on a third-party independent consultant to help with OCM.
Sure. So assuming they know change management well and they're experts in change management, you're getting that value of having someone who's an expert in it. That's what they focus on. They're not trying to focus on technology. They're not trying to focus on other things. They're focused on change management. So that's the benefit. The risk is that you rely too much on the consultant and you don't own the change the way you need to. So my suggestion would be you do a hybrid of speed round question number 2 and question number 3, which is combine the internal with some sort of outside third-party change management expert, not your system integrator, which, to your point, I don't think your system integrator should be doing change management, or at least not a large part of it, maybe little pieces of it, but that's the piece of it. And then the other piece is that you want to have that outside expertise or people that can help with the change piece of it.
Right. Ownership is a big component to this. Own your project, and it'll turn out how you envision it to turn out, rather than putting too many eggs in other people's baskets.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good job. You passed the game. You won.
Thank you. Hopefully I did better on that one than I did the last time. I think I failed the last one, if I remember right. I didn't pass that test.
I love it.
All right. Well, thanks for being here today, guys. This was a great conversation. We covered a lot of ground here today, and pretty far-reaching ground as well. So thanks for all your support here today and for hosting with us. And also thanks to the audience for listening. Hope you found value in this, and hope you'll go back and listen to other episodes. If you haven't already, go check those out. And again, every Wednesday we release new episodes on YouTube and all the typical audio podcast platforms as well. So hope you all have a great day. Thanks for listening to Transformation Ground Control, and we'll see you next time.